für Museen bedeutet. Wir haben heute hier auf dem Podium Gäste sitzen, die sich ganz intensiv mit genau diesen Fragen auch beschäftigen, auf ganz unterschiedlicher Ebene, und wir werden das Gespräch auf Englisch führen und es gibt auch einen Livestream auf Instagram, und ich bedanke mich bei Ute Weingarten und Artpress, die diese Talks für die ganze Messe vorbereitet haben. Herzlich willkommen. Ich möchte Ihnen, first of all, I want to introduce my guests. You see here on the right Coraly von Bismarck. She is working at one of the biggest galleries, PACE, and has just been becoming the director of PACE X, which is a new platform for new projects, which you will introduce and tell us about in a second. Then we have Nina Raftopoulo from Independent Collectors, which is the biggest online platform for collectors. On my left side you see Simon Speiser. He's an artist living in Berlin, working with all the digital tools that we have nowadays, like VR, artificial intelligence you told me about you're working on, but you also work with conservative tools from the old handicraft, but you will let us know about that as well. And then we have Ben Vickers. I'm very happy that you're here today. He comes from London, from the Serpentine Galleries. You do so many things. You're a curator, you're publishing articles, you are basically involved in the new technologies for a long time. And I'm very happy that you're here today because I think you give a lot of new input for us. Maybe too new, we'll see. So I think I would like to start with you, Ben, because you have prepared a little introduction for this talk today. So first technical problems start now.
Okay, so before I start this presentation, my presentation doesn't involve any of the artworks that I've been involved in producing or commissioning, and it's more a kind of framing and thinking about how technology is developed and the role that it plays in artistic production in this moment in time. But it's probably worth, for people that are not familiar with the work that I've done at the Serpentine Galleries, over the course of the last 5 or 6 years, I've been developing and producing a series of new experiments in art and technology, working with artists such as Hito Style, Ian Cheng, James Bridle, to realize quite technically complex works that feature as exhibitions or large-scale installations. This year we also produced a program called Augmented Architecture, which takes the Pavilion program that we do each year at the Serpentine and apply it to augmented reality. So with that said, I think maybe probably the other thing worth saying is that my job title is quite unusual. It's Chief Technology Officer. Typically that title appears more in corporations, technology companies, but what that role encompasses is quite holistic. So it's thinking about the overall strategy of the institution and how technology, but also kind of changing states in the world, affect how an institution can develop. And I'm also responsible for the systems architecture and kind of overall thinking about how to reconfigure departments so that they can embrace accelerating change. And that's something that I wanted to talk about a little bit in terms of framing this discussion that has to do with digitalization, but also new forms of cooperation. So if you go to the first slide. So the way that we understand, and this is why it's horrible to work with technology. So if you think about the development of technology, it's clear that the world has been very disrupted in the last few years by certain technologies coming to maturity. One of the ways to understand this is that at any moment in time, you get the emergence of a series of technologies. So if you imagine in the 90s, we get the emergence of things like social media, video, mobile, and 3G. And if you click to the next slide. So whilst those things are kind of novel and quite important, it's actually at the intersection of these technologies that you get massive kind of transformation. So it wasn't until we got the emergence of these technologies that you got the emergence of things like Airbnb, Uber, etc. And those things fundamentally like shifted the shape of the world. If we can have the next slide. So the next slide is to kind of make the point that we're in a moment in time where there is a set of technologies that are equally disruptive as the internet, all coming simultaneously. So virtual reality, blockchain, robotics, drones, and artificial intelligence. And then if we have the next slide. We have no idea what will happen when these technologies begin to merge and the sorts of things that will emerge out of it. But we're also in this moment of kind of accelerating change. If we go to the next slide, where we've got the emergence of biotechnology through CRISPR-Cas9, where you can edit genomes. We have cheap aerospace, where you can put a satellite in space for $10,000, quantum computing, and artificial general intelligence. And if you go to the next slide, we have absolutely no idea what the shape of the world will look like when these things combine. Now, if we go to the next slide, there's something that's used in the kind of McKinsey kind of consultancy circles to advise on how technologies emerge, and it's called the Gartner's Hype Cycle. This is the Gartner's Hype Cycle from 2017. And basically, you have expectations running up this axis, and then along the bottom you have time. And so you have an innovation trigger, which is the moment in which the possibility of a technology emerges, and then over time it enters something called the trough of disillusionment. So the moment in which people created enormous hype around a technology, and then it failed to deliver on expectations. The reason why this is quite important is that, as you can see from this slide, it's the slope of enlightenment or the plateau of productivity, so the later stage of development in which a technology starts to be used by museums. And the reason why that's important is because at that stage in a technology's development cycle, basically all the decisions about what that technology can do in the world have already been made. So if you go to the next slide. So this is the Gartner's Hype Cycle from 2018, and you can see that machine learning and virtual reality aren't even on the innovation horizon anymore. But it is only in this moment that you're starting to see technologies emerge into the art world and artists working with them. So the thing that I'm interested in working towards is how do you get artists involved in the innovation trigger or the kind of peak of inflated expectations? So how can you forge new relationships between the research departments in, say, Google AI or DeepMind so that artists can have a fundamental influence on the shape of those technologies? So if we just go very quickly through the next few slides. So it's worth also pointing out that we're starting to see the kind of disruptive effect of technologies on the art world, and these things are beginning to come quite fast in the last few years. So I'm sure that we're going to hear about TeamLab today, but if people are not familiar, TeamLab is a company of about 400 people as an artist collective that created their own museum that now is visited more than the Vincent van Gogh Museum. Next slide. So about 2 or 3 months ago, Apple launched their augmented reality art tours, and they didn't really involve the art world in any way. And what the augmented reality art tours are about is creating a large-scale augmented reality cloud that sits over the living environment, and they kind of roll out art experiences. Why would an institution even they don't need institutions to be involved in this at all. So it opens up kind of big questions about how art will be developed over the next 10 or 20 years. Next slide. And then you have these like very interesting phenomena happening where you have people like Daniel Birnbaum, who's a friend, leaving his position as a director at a public institution to become the artistic director of a private company that's developing virtual reality artworks. And we might speculate that this is just the beginning of that. So increasingly that you have artistic directors moving into tech companies. Next slide. So why is this important? So this is a very crude history of public institutions, museums. I kind of summarize it in 3 parts. There's a kind of prehistory of the museum, which is the Cabinet of Curiosity. You have the Enlightenment Project, which people like Henry Kissinger are now saying is collapsing. And then you have the kind of state-run museum that acts as a tool of culture. The reason why all of this stuff is important in this moment in time is because we're entering a moment where we don't necessarily know what the museum or public institutions are fundamentally for, so they're in this moment of kind of existential questioning. And the way that these technologies begin to impact these scenes and ecosystems will have a profound impact over the course of the next 20 to 100 years of the role of art within society. And that's why I work at this intersection, and it's also the reason why I think the question of cooperation is fundamentally important. And then there's 3 more slides. So these are 3 questions that we're asking at the Serpentine that are kind of feeding into a report that we will publish next year, which is looking at the way in which you have all these emergent trends and things that will have very severe impacts in the way of the kind of business as usual. So the questions we're asking is, how will the future art ecosystem evolve from this point on? What tools, practices and capabilities are required to care for and foster new arts infrastructure? And then the third question, which is quite fundamental, what role are each of us playing in the creation of a future arts ecosystem? That's quite important because it feels at this moment in time that most institutions and most actors in the art field are playing from a reactive position, and in order to maintain and preserve the things that are important within the kind of artistic sphere that we understand, it's important that we're not reactive and we think about how we carry those things into a kind of next phase of development. So that's a short presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There was a lot of impact. Just to make one point a bit clearer for me, would you say that the future of the institution of a museum, as we were used to for like many, many years, decades, is going to disappear at some point and will be replaced, or is it going to be a coalition between, say, the technical possibilities that open up almost like visual museums in itself, plus the institution that we can actually go to, visit, have a ticket, and so on?
So, I think it's always difficult to speculate on things. My sense right now is that you're beginning to see a kind of fragmentation or splintering, and that increasingly, like the Serpentine Gallery, for example, is looking less and less like Tate Modern, for example. So you're already starting to see that fragmentation. But I think if you consider what were the forces that were acting in the world that led to the proliferation of arts institutions globally, and it was globalization, large injections of capital, the art market, etc. We're in a moment in which the project of globalization is in somewhat difficulty. Global trade is slowing down. And then you also have tech companies that have more money than nation states in order to articulate projects. So, you might imagine if you consider that the nation state used the museum as a way to proliferate culture and shape identity, if tech companies start to put in the same level of capital into arts development, then you could imagine a situation in the future where MoMA is just the research and development department of Google, for example. Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily going to happen, but I'd say there's big possibilities of what will happen.
But what would be the danger if the corporates are more important than independent museums? I mean, we have a very kind of independent museum scene in Germany. It's subsidized, which is obviously very different from most other countries in the world. But does that mean that Google and Amazon and all the big corporates are telling us what we have to see in the future?
I think that's a very good question that maybe could be part of our discussion today.
Okay, so we have a very interesting Coraly situation with you in your new job, because PACE-X is basically exactly working with those tools for the future. Maybe you can tell us more about exactly the questions that we have already written here.
Hello. Okay. Thank you, Ben, for making such a great introduction to the ecosystem and how that might change. And so as a gallery, you have to think about how you fit into that art ecosystem. So as a gallery, you support artists, and you help them to have a network and infrastructure. You help with production so they can sustain their practices. And as much as the art changes, you kind of have to rethink that support system. So that was the idea behind PhasX, to really take art outside of the wide cube context and support artists beyond that. And really embrace the digital age, because that's the reality we live in, and it's just natural that becomes part of art production. And so we have a lot of artists that are fascinated by new technologies, and so some of them implement them as part of the production process, but it also obviously changes the way it's shared, it's perceived, it's distributed. So do you want to show an image? Yes. Ben mentioned TeamLab earlier, and what's interesting about TeamLab is it's a collective of over 500 people, so it's not one single artist. They're based in Tokyo, and they bring together all kinds of different disciplines. So there are architects, artists, computer scientists, programmers, and they have a very collective approach. And they create digital environments that are rendered in real time, in many cases not pre-programmed. And what you see here is an image taken at the Borderless Museum in Tokyo that opened last year. That has been a huge success. As Ben mentioned, it has there have been over 2.3 million visitors since it opened last year. And so let's take a moment to look at this image here, because you see people who are really immersed in the kind of in the installation. So a lot of the artists, not only TeamLab but also other artists that we work with, they really invite active participation, and they put the viewer and the group of the viewers as an individual, as a group, at the center of their work. So really, it's a dynamic process, and the artwork changes depending on how the viewer maneuvers through the space.
So in some ways, what changes here as well is if we take technology as almost like a new possibility to become part of the art itself, it's a different way of perceiving art as well, isn't it? Because it's surrounding us as a 360-grade experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are different layers to it. Obviously, there's social media where it's a different kind of participation that can also become part of the art. But here it's very much in the art itself. And
I mean, if we think about, we have just started, but when you think about the future, TeamLab, for example, is a new project as in itself, because you have so many disciplines working there. It's interdisciplinary, but it's obviously working with a new technology. You as somebody who's now working with those people, would you say it's something that is still kind of a small group of artists who are implying that in their work, or is it kind of getting more and more? Because obviously the audience, I think, is not as far as most artists are themselves. So in some ways, we are almost a step back as a kind of conservative audience when it comes to the artists who are a step further.
I think the audience is important, because the audience is changing, and as I said earlier, the way art is being perceived and shared and experienced, that opens up a new kind of audience. And there's growing, the artists that work in that kind of field is growing, and as much as technologies change and these social transformations are happening. So,
right. I can actually pass on this question to Simon. I mean, you are working with a lot of technical tools, and maybe to let the people know who are listening to us, your family comes from Ecuador, from some of your, yeah?
Yeah, my dad is from Ecuador.
So you were actually risen up with pure nature, and now you're working with VR and all the new technical tools. Maybe you can tell us more a bit about your
that's something that I'm very much interested in. And I mean, my dad has a cacao farm in Ecuador, and it's a place that I've always been going to since I was a little child. And I think that's something. Yeah, I have these two fascinations, and one is like technology, and the other side is like very just like rainforest and like nature and like a form that we are not very much used to anymore, living in like cities and stuff. But yeah, I think it's kind of interesting to think of like how can we kind of like bridge between that and kind of find like ways to integrate or like connect us back into nature through technology as well. In many ways of like also when it comes to maybe meditation or like kind of like a spiritual ideas and like kind of like ancient knowledge. I mean, now I'm working on a new project where we're trying to kind of like pick up this ideas of like shamanism and like how this knowledge always gets like passed on, and how can you project something into the future and bring this maybe also like into like a form of AI that it advises us and kind of like guides us through life, and like how can that kind of like technology be also like spiritual in some way.
Maybe you can tell us, this is one of your projects, maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. This is a piece that's it's a VR piece that is inspired by a children's book called Momo, and I really like this idea where in Momo there's like flowers that embody time, and so like time becomes like a material, and so I created like a very rhythmic piece that is very kind of like very simple beat like structure, like it's like a clock basically. But then you basically forget about time when you're in there. It kind of like hypnotizes you, and you lose track of time, and
I mean, when you say you try to combine the two, the kind of nature of things, as in the nature of things, and also the technological part of it, would you say that we have to, in the future, get used to the fact that we replace nature by a kind of mimesis of nature through technology?
I mean, I think it's kind of like a human instinct to kind of like really control things and like kind of like shape the world around us. But I think also that like technology, as it's always like coding, for example, like you always build up on knowledge that at some point you don't understand how the whole code works by itself. Like it's like with like machine learning and stuff. Like people don't really understand anymore how the machine thinks, or like how it comes to those conclusions. And so I think there's a moment where like nature or like basically grows in itself inside of technology, and like tech becomes like its own organic being. And I think that's a very interesting point, and I think that's something that has a lot to do with what you were saying, that there's many question marks what we don't know which directions we're going to go, and that I think that we can really understand a lot when we look into nature.
I mean, Ben, coming back to this point, do you think that the technology, let's put it positively in this way, gives us as an audience a complete new way of perceiving art as such, because we kind of become much more, not just kind of this dialogue, this is me, this is the artwork, but it's going to be a whole thing in itself. Is that possibly a part of the future?
Just kind of like throw off everything I previously said. So the definition of technology that I work to is comes from the science fiction writer Ursula Le Guin. And Le Guin says that technology is the active human interface with the world. And she was heavily criticized in her science fiction novels for not using technology as we understand it. And so I guess the thing that's interesting about what we refer to as technology in this moment is that it is the most malleable space. And really what you're talking about is a language that allows you to kind of extend into spaces and concepts and ways of working that are, it's possible to kind of disrupt their meaning in this moment, right? So with artificial intelligence, suddenly again we have to return to the question of authorship, originals, autonomy, all of these ideas which are actually, art has been hashing those out for hundreds and if not thousands of years. So I think that when we talk about technology, actually what we're talking about is a kind of new terrain in which to have the same conversations. And so the idea of, a kind of, if you take Team Lab as an example, it's not just that it's technological, it's not dissimilar to say like Gregor Schneider, Christopher Buchel, all of these artists that were creating these totally immersive environments as a response to something that they felt in that moment. So just to problematize what I've already said.
Nina, you are working as the director of Independent Collectors, which is the biggest platform for collectors. And when we hear about the future, what does that mean for the collectors? I mean, because the collectors you represent, I think, are mostly working with the old media as such. And it's also a question, we come back to that later, how we actually as a collector can buy things like that at all, or is it not something that is more interesting for museums at all? How do you perceive that when you look at the collector's side?
Well, first of all, I feel a little left out because I don't have a presentation, so I'm sorry about that. All I brought was a newspaper. So it's probably the most analog medium you can think of.
It's good. We need that for the future as well.
I'll get into this in a second. So we're a digital platform, but I guess I would say we're probably the oldest platform for collectors online, so it makes us kind of a digital oldie. And we were founded in 2008 as a platform for like-minded people. It was a non-commercial project. There was no business model attached to it, and the only reason to found it was because we wanted to bring like-minded people together and talk about art in a hopefully substantial way, in a meaningful way. And then over the years, we started out as a sort of closed-off community, and we wanted to create a different model. Basically, what we saw in the analog world, which was a very exclusive realm, where people didn't have access to the art world. We wanted to not do that online, but after a few years, we ended up with a replica of the analog world, and we decided that we wanted to open this platform up to the public, and to really create a space where people could talk to one another. And so we're kind of, even though we're digital at our core, we're kind of a bit, we kind of criticize this digital realm a little bit. So.
But what we just listened to, would you say that for the future of collecting, the digital tools that we have is the one hand, but on the other hand, we have this creation of new worlds, we have this creation of new artwork. Do you think that collectors are open for these kind of new works, the ones that you work with basically on your platform?
Well, there's no general answer to this because collecting or collectors are so diverse. In our platform or in our community, there are, obviously the usual blue chip collectors and white old men and all those sorts. People who are used to the old world and don't want it to change, for sure. But then there's lots of emerging collectors who are super open to digital projects and digital platforms online. And it's just, there's no generalization, I don't think. But there's a huge difference between older and younger generations, that's for sure.
The interesting thing that Ben picked up, obviously, Team Lab is a good example for that, is that you don't have the artist. You don't, we go around here on the art fair and we see there's a painting, this is by one artist. You show your work, it's like you. But how difficult does it become for you as somebody who represents a gallery, and obviously you have to, find collectors who are interested in your new work, to tell them, well, actually, it's not this one person, there are 400 people, and it's like a group, production, and it's something that is probably not something that you can have at home. Maybe, how does that change your work as a gallerist, basically?
So on the collector side, or on the audience side, you also don't have the one collector any longer. And you have to support artists who are very much working the experience-led world. You have to rethink the business model. So TeamLab is a good example. We had a show in Palo Alto a couple of years ago, and for the first time we asked, it was a ticketed show, so people would come in and pay to see the show, which is a very unusual thing for a gallery to do. And then we gave the artist a percentage of the proceeds of the ticket sales. That's a tested model, and as I explained earlier, especially for TeamLab, it works very well. And so this is something that we will explore and expand.
Can I ask, on the subject of cooperation, you're in an interesting situation, right? Because you represent artists that themselves are potentially able to run companies at a more efficient rate than the gallery itself.
Yeah.
And then PACE is like pivoting into, is it possible for us to open out this experience model into the art world more generally and broader audiences? But how do you negotiate that kind of relationship when TeamLab is generating tens, if not hundreds of millions? How does the gallery itself maintain leverage in that position?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Obviously, TeamLab, they don't need a gallery. So they are not the traditional gallery. So you need to think about new ways to work together. But it's actually from TeamLab, we learned a lot that also applies to other artists who may not have 500 people in the studios. And so it's kind of opened us up for you touched on as well about the shared experience, about the shared economy, and how you can, value shared experience over individual ownership. And then you also need to grow your expertise. Obviously, as the artists, engage with new technologies, you don't necessarily have to engage with them as well, but you have to kind of learn to understand them and maybe facilitate and help them to implement these tools. I think that's our role as a gallery. And also it goes in both sides. So technology companies, they like the exchange with artists. And I think we will operate more as a platform than a gallery and really create a pool of, in-depth knowledge and exchange of ideas.
But do you see a danger that basically, we were talking about corporates, and in some ways, a big gallery like PACE is almost like a corporate, when you look at the size and the power and the money behind it. Is there for the future, because obviously, coming back to Germany, the museums just don't have the money to, not the least money to actually support those kind of projects. So what does that mean in the future? Is the museum then in the end an institution as a marketing tool for the corporates who actually have the money and the power to finance those kind of projects?
I think it really depends on the decisions that are made by those institutions. And I guess in the case of Germany, that's very much running at a kind of state policy level, because I think that there would be a lot, in Germany specifically, I think there would be a lot of pushback for, Amazons and Googles and things like this. In the UK, that's less the case. And then the UK is also faced kind of severe austerity over a kind of longer period of time. So the kind of finding a funding model that works. But I think it's clear both for commercial galleries, traditional commercial galleries, existing institutions, that somewhat the game is up, and there is a need to create a new kind of model. And I think the thing to consider is like the historical, if we take conceptual art as an example, right? It's been the kind of dominant monoculture of contemporary art for 40, 50 years now. You could, as a museum, double down on that position, right? And just be like, we're just not going to show any technology, and we're just going to maintain, we're going to be very, very good at showing this history and this lineage of artwork. And that's fine if you don't want a continual growth model. And I think that, in the same way, if you look on an even longer time horizon, you take the Catholic Church as an example, which also was a great funder of art, and the place in which most people witness artworks, and they just doubled down on the sacred, right? So I guess it's a question of like, are existing institutions going to give up their position in the race to become like a kind of tech theme park? Or are they going to get really good and refined at what they already do? And I guess an interesting question is there an in-between?
I mean, how is it for you as an artist? I mean, you are confronted with those questions, and also, I mean, once you start using technology, just the VR is not something that you can go into a shop and you buy it. It's a lot of impact. It needs a lot of financing and things like that. So how do you see it for you as an artist in the future, or right now when you work on your projects?
I mean, of course, there is like how do you get into, or like how does like a gallery or like a museum give the structure, like the technical tools that you need to show that. But I think it's getting also easier and easier, and it's like evolving so quickly that like there's always new tools to work with, and I think that's kind of like what I'm also always interested in, and like what are the new technologies that you can use and like create new experiences or like new ways to produce something. The big problem is though that it's very costly, and so I think that's why it's also like very important to have this new ideas of like how corporations could work, and like collaborations can be facilitated, and yeah, I mean there's also like this collective aspect of producing is. I mean, like if you do a VR piece, you need a programmer, you need somebody to do the sound, to make music, to voices, whatever. Like you have to do 3D modeling or 3D scanning. There's so many aspects to it that it leans much more into working in a collaborative manner, and I think I'm enjoying that a lot. Like like also when I moved to Berlin 2 years ago. Like the perfect ground to find all these people to work with, and before I was working a lot by myself in the studio, and now I'm like really much more on working with many people together, and that's I'm enjoying that a lot.
And when you look at the situation as an artist doing that in Germany, do you find the platforms, do you find the scenarios, the rooms, the spaces where you can actually present your work?
I mean, there is definitely an interest for it. I think there's definitely much headroom to grow, for sure. And it's like a big question is still the market. Like the market is not following things as quickly. And it's also the big question, like how do you sell a VR piece? I mean, that's what do you buy when you buy a VR piece? Like is it just files? Is it like becomes a hazardous sculpture, or like what is kind of the thing? And there's many things to be figured out, but I think it's interesting stuff like Akut is doing. I'm still a bit wondering like where's the young stuff happening in there, because they're mostly working with like very big artists that they're not native to it, and that's something I'm a bit confused about. But I hope there's something moving. But I'm curious to see what those kind of like new platforms can bring to the table.
I mean, talking about the audience, you are involved with many collectors through your work. Would you say that it's something that is also the new tech scene that is only open for that, or would you say that it's more like almost like an educational process that is starting now, that we have to not only use the digital tools in our daily life, but also see that this could be a really interesting future for the arts world?
Well, it's definitely an interesting future, and it's so weird to see. Personally, I think it's weird that people are so afraid of digitalization, and especially collectors. And especially in Germany, it's treated as like a disease almost, and I don't really understand why. And I feel like half of the people out there are super afraid, and the other half, mostly people from the tech world or from a corporate side, kind of take advantage of that fear. And there's a lot of, to be honest, a lot of populists out there who keep saying that we have to find digital solutions and disruptive models and to really change the system and find new collaboration models. And I feel sometimes that, I mean, so far none of these models have really disrupted the existing system, which is probably a good thing. And I don't think we're going to see massive changes in the future, but we have to be able to integrate digitalization smoothly into practices and into also cooperation models, for sure.
I just wanted to say, I think that's a really good point in terms of this kind of idea of disruption. Because if you look at Silicon Valley and you look at some of the claims that are made, which are always completely ridiculous and audacious, there was a promise like 5 or 10 years ago that education would be entirely revolutionized by online courses, and like literally every single one of those startups has failed. They haven't transformed education. And in the art world, if you kind of reframe or you look slightly differently at the history of art in terms of innovating new forms of organization, innovating new models of education, if you take something like the Bauhaus as like a startup, like it has a century-long like history, and so it's. I think we're in this interesting. There's an interesting opportunity right now that requires dialogue of a certain kind, because increasingly tech companies are moving into spheres of expertise and kind of claiming that space as like a blank canvas. So virtual reality is an example. Why are not more architects involved in the construction of virtual space? Why are artists not involved in like how you gauge like an object in a virtual space? And so there's an important like space of dialogue that's probably less about disruption and more about kind of collaboration. But there's a problem right now in terms of, I guess the thing that I've come to learn about the tech world is the reason why there's little collaboration with the artistic space is because it comes from a sort of class position that they consider themselves to be the disruptors to the planet, and they're overturning the existing structures of the elite, and that the art world is one of the few places that it hasn't been able to disrupt, and so it considers it to be a very elitist, aristocratic place, which in many ways it is. But that's one of the reasons why you're not seeing this change. So I also think the point that you made in terms of it won't change is that also the art world may just continue to be like immune to those kinds of relationships. And that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Is that something that you can relate to? That you think that, because you work in some ways with a conservative part of the arts as such, and you take basically the aura of nature, that's one of your sources, major sources, and on the other hand, obviously you transfer it into something else. But do you need both worlds? That what Ben just described, Nina?
I mean, I think it's always important to bridge things. I think it's like, like for example, for this VR piece, like I made also like a fabric that's woven. It's basically like a still from the VR piece materialized into a fabric, and there's like lots of things that connect as well. Like weaving was kind of like automated weaving was kind of like the foundation for programming. With Ada Lovelace, she developed like weaving machines and basically invented the punch cards with it, and then kind of like grew into something that is now like our knowledge, like computer science and stuff. And it's kind of interesting to see that there's always connections between like traditional or like kind of like the older ideas that connected to like what we see as something very futuristic or new. Same as like what I was saying about like how like nature's like the machine is gonna become like an organic object or like a being. I think that's something that is like, yeah, it's always important to think of like cycles and that's why I'm trying to kind of like bridge between like, yeah, like how can you do something that is like virtual but then also like have something material to it.
Can I just say that what I really love about your work is that it doesn't emerge from digitalization. You don't put it at the center of things, but you just use it as a tool. And what's actually the essence of your work is kind of, it's nature and it's sort of an archaic state of mind, which has nothing to do with digitalization. And I think it's great that you combine the two, but you don't pretend that it can only work because we live in this era of digitalization.
I mean, this is also a question I had for you. When you look at the older artists that Pace is representing, how do they perceive Pace X? Is it like, it's this crazy new generation of people who are doing something that has nothing to do with me, or is there actually a communication between, say, the old artistic world and the new one? So how is it seen within the company?
Yes, so we are very much rooted in the tradition of Pace Gallery. And Pace Gallery always has a tradition of innovation, and they broke ground in the 1960s when artists like James Turrell and Robert Irvin were pioneers of experiential art, and they celebrated in exchange with technological companies. And so many of the artists that we work with today, they look back at that tradition. But obviously today, it's a new, emerging, generation of artists that work in very different ways. They reflect the time we are in right now. And, the audience has changed as well. And, so I think it's a natural kind of evolving process from that. And we don't see ourselves that much as disruptors, but we're adding to the system, I think. And it's a process, it's a dynamic process.
What you said before, Nina, I think is very interesting because it's this fear of technology. And I think it's just very much in our DNA here, actually. Because when we look at America or even at Britain, I think it's different. Why do you think is that in this country? Why are we more conservative? Are we more afraid of the new? What is it that kind of makes us so reluctant?
Well, I'm Greek, half-Greek, so it's difficult for me to answer this. I think we are wonderfully suspicious of corporate interests, and that's a good thing. And I think we are very protective of our museums, and it should continue to be like that. So hopefully we're not going to get rid of this fear altogether. But I don't really have a clear answer to this. I think we're just a little behind, and especially in the art world, probably 10 years behind. And we'll see if people catch up, but I think it might be a good balance, to this greed and this hyper-consumerism that we see all over the world. Maybe that's a good thing.
Right. Do you see that when you are in conversation with, say, museums here in Germany? Do you feel that what Nina was just describing, that there's a kind of reluctance or skepticism more than maybe in your country?
Well, I think it's in the UK as well. I think there's a deep skepticism because there's if you look at the schools from which people emerge into curation, so it's the RCA, it's Bard, it's a very small pool in the same way as Oxford or Cambridge, etc. Populate the political class in the UK. So there's a very kind of narrow perspective that doesn't really represent the true plurality of what artistic expression has expressed for a long time. So there's a natural kind of conservatism, I think, inside those institutions to work in these kinds of ways, because it's a very particular mindset and a very particular culture that's very close-knit. So the reaction to it is always kind of negative. And I mean, I obviously always occupy, and my work occupies a somewhat ambiguous position, but for most people on the surface, it's not ambiguous, and I'm an ally to the corporate elite, etc., because I do work with Google, and I do work with these kinds of companies. But my model of like the work that is necessary to do is quite different to other people's, because I am deeply anxious about companies that can make changes to 2 billion people's lives in one change of an interface. And if we don't start to build bridges into those worlds, then there's going to be no dialogue. And so, the art world, quite generally, is very good at doubling down on a conservative, let's close the gates, don't let them in. And that's not, I really think that's an error, that's a kind of error of judgment in this moment in time, but it's also an expression of what's happening politically, globally. Like, there's not a desire for dialogue and understanding. There's a very rapid, like, shutting down, pulling up the drawbridge, and kind of balkanization of countries, and that spells trouble. But for art, it can also be beautiful, right? Because you end up with artists that are like trapped on an island together, and they construct the weirdest possible ideas, and then you get this kind of multiplicity of thinking. So it's not necessarily bad for art making, but I think more broadly for society that it's problematic, and the nuance involved in like one corporation to another. I personally don't use Apple products, and I never would. But that comes about as a result of a relationship to particular systems and having a literacy about them. Google, I'm not sure about. Amazon, they're working with the military in the US, but I also, like books, and they write quickly.
Well, I think at this point we have to finish now the talk. It's 1 o'clock. Thank you very much. I think the future is going to be, I think that's actually the bottom line. We have to stay on the dialogue. I think the dialogue in two worlds, existing next to each other, that could be quite a good future, I think. Thank you very much for all of you for coming here. Vielen Dank für Ihre Aufmerksamkeit, und Sie können natürlich jederzeit noch mit den Geladenen ins Gespräch kommen nach diesem Talk, und wir freuen uns, wenn Sie um 15 Uhr vielleicht nochmal mit dabei sind. Vielen Dank.